In case you have not read or watched Waiting for Godot, a brief summary is that it centers around two characters named Vladimir and Estragon, who simply wait endlessly for someone named or something called Godot who never ends up arriving. The setting of the play is bleak. It takes place in an empty landscape with a singular tree that slowly grows during the play. The play centers around the idea of repetition and uncertainty, creating the sense of endless cycles. The characters cannot seem to move forward no matter how much they try. Some of the main themes that you'll see is time, hopelessness, absurdity, and the search for meaning. The play itself revolves around subjectivity, meaning anyone can derive any meaning from it as long as they back it up with evidence, of course. For example, a lot of people tend to interpret the play as a religious play. For example, Godot is interpreted as like an afterlife or God, as the first three letters are God spelled out. However, it's important to note that no matter what interpretation the reader gets from it, the author never has a clear meaning to it, meaning it's universal and subjective to the person. So then the question is, how does this relate to my own literary identity, and how has this formed my literary identity thus far? So prior to reading Waiting for Godot, I always interpreted texts with like one singular meaning. In my eyes, is that there was only one correct objective interpretation to any literary text I was given. I often felt confined to this preset idea of answers, and rather than having an open interpretation for myself or others. So when I read Waiting for Godot for the first time, it introduced me to a different way of reading. The play itself refuses to give clear answers and leaves a lot of questions up to interpretation and unresolved. The author never gives you one set meaning, therefore you can interpret it however you want. This in turn showed me that literature can be subjective, personal, and evolving to person. Literature is no longer a fixed definition of my mind. In turn, I kind of think of as like reading books as more so a universal thing that can be interpreted differently for everyone. So to bring up this idea of literacy sponsors, Deborah Brandt defined this as people, institutions, or cultural forces that shape literacy practices. So in my case, my early sponsors would be teachers or testing systems or the public school system. This limited my idea of literature to becoming only one correct answer. However, now my literacy sponsor would be more aligned with Waiting for Godot, who encouraged critical thinking, questioning, and self-defined meaning. This idea kind of shows me that literacy sponsors don't just teach us to read and write, but they also shape the way we think about everything around us, such as literature, how we interpret it with our lives, or even our worldview. My own definition of literacy sponsors complicates Reddit's definition because it evolves to include a more interpretive and intellectual growth over time. So, Reddit mostly discusses literacy sponsors in economic and social terms. However, my definition follows like a fluid and ongoing nature of sponsorship. It's not something that happens once in childhood, but something that continuously reshapes meaning and understanding throughout life. Meaning, my literacy sponsor of like whenever I was in elementary school or middle school isn't going to be the same as it is now. And because of that, my interpretation is going to be wildly different and focus on different things rather than my interpretation being formed once and it staying the same throughout my lifetime. On page 3, Brannett says that sponsors, as we ordinarily think of them, are powerful figures who bankroll events or smooth the way for initiates. This definition, while easy to understand, doesn't really take into account that literacy sponsors can change over time, and thus, whenever we think of old literacy sponsors, we won't think of them as this quote-unquote powerful figures who bankroll events or smooth the way initiates. Because of that, these literacy sponsors won't be as effective, and therefore we won't consider them literacy sponsors of our current mindsets. For me, the clip that really displays this universality and subjectivity is the second to last scene. So this scene depicts Vladimir, one of the main characters, questioning a little boy, who is a recurring character that appeared earlier on into the play, who seems to know Godot. This itself creates an unsettling shift for the viewer as the viewer slowly realizes that they're in an endless time loop in life. Every day, the same people will come by saying the same things, but the things will be slightly different, leading to an unsettling narrative. Vladimir and Estragon, interestingly enough, despite being said to be there for over 50 years, don't actually remember anything that from the previous days. The only one who seems to show some form of idea of what happened or any form of memory is Vladimir. But other than simple questioning, he still ends up dismissing it and going back with Estragon to wait for Godot.
Mr. Godot. Do you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Well?
He does nothing, sir.
How's your brother?
He's sick, sir.
Perhaps it was he came yesterday.
I don't know, sir.
Has he a beard, Mr. Godot?
Yes, sir.
Fair? Or black? Or red?
I think it's white, sir.
Christ have mercy on us.
What am I to tell Mr. Godot, sir?
Tell him you saw me, and that you saw me. You're sure you saw me? You won't come and tell me tomorrow that you never saw me!
Now, the main symbol that seems to show this subjective idea is Estragon holding his boots. So, his boots is a recurring symbol of the play. If you see it in the earlier clips, in the beginning of the play, he actually keeps struggling to put it on. They never fit properly, etc. So, this represents his inability to move on in life. To me, this play is relatable for these reasons. It doesn't shy away from the idea that maybe our suffering is self-inflicted, and maybe all it takes for this to change is for us to take the step and change things for ourselves, rather than holding on to a false hope. However, to another person, it can be interpreted wildly differently. Again, it could be interpreted in a religious context, so maybe Estragon not being able to put on his boots could symbolize him not following quote unquote God's plan or some other religious um, meaning derived from it. To summarize my points, before reading Waiting for Godot, I believed literature was rigid, there was always one single correct meaning, something I was supposed to find if I had looked hard enough. That belief came from my earlier literacy sponsors, like teachers in schools, who often emphasized objective answers over interpretation. However, Godot shifted that perspective completely. It showed me that literature doesn't have to be about solving one right answer. Instead, it can be about themes that feel universal but also personal, themes that can change depending on who is reading it. Now, as a reader and writer, I value that ambiguity. I see interpretation not as a weakness, but as a strength. I no longer approach texts searching for the answer. I approach them searching for my answer, my personal connection to the literature piece. That realization has shaped the way I read, the way I write, and the way I think about language itself. In the end, Godot didn't just change how I read a play, it changed how I define meaning.